Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Most Censored News. I'm Lee Camp. Thanks for being here. Really a pleasure to have everybody here with us. Please share this, tweet it out, click subscribe, all those good things. I have an excellent guest for you today. This is part of our on. Hold on. I'm doing the thing where I play myself back to me, which is always a bad idea. But I have an excellent guest for you today, and this is part of our ongoing interview series. We've already talked to Scott Ritter, Stephen Donziger, Chris Hedges, Alan McLeod, so many great people. So I hope you will support this show, and we'll keep doing these if you'll keep enjoying them and sharing them and watching them. So today I am speaking with Diane Sare. She is, or was for 2022, a candidate for the U.S. Senate, and has announced she's running again in 2024. And she ran for U.S. Senate, and there's a lot about that we'll get into in the conversation. But one of the most interesting aspects of it was that during her campaign for U.S. Senate as a LaRouche Party candidate, she was labeled by the Ukrainian government, by a Ukrainian government committee, as an information terrorist, along with Rand Paul and others. And they said they also wanted to bring war crimes charges against the people on that list. And this was all for speaking clearly and often about the truth of what is happening in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine. And for that, she's called a terrorist, and they're seeking war crimes against her. So I want to talk to her about that, but a lot of other things as well, as you'll see. So without further ado, here is Diane Sare.
Hi. Hello. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. Thanks for taking the time.
Glad to be here.
So congrats on a pretty damn good showing in your Senate race for an independent candidate.
Yeah, actually it was much higher, and I don't know if you saw the interesting thing that happened with my vote, but it decreased by 50% on television. Wasn't even secret.
Well, I mean, if you want to start there, we can start there. So what, on the night of the election, what happened with the votes?
Well, they claimed I had 55,000 votes, which already I think was low, given that I got 66,000 signatures just to get my name on the ballot, but
right. We'll
take it. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot of that because I didn't expect it to go down. That's unusual. So a friend of mine in France sent an email saying something really weird is happening with your vote. The more votes come in, the fewer votes you have. And he did the first screenshot at 53,000 votes. So I went to sleep thinking, all right, whatever, I don't know. The next morning I woke up and it said I had 29,000 votes. And then by Friday it was down to 25,000 votes. And there were some very interesting things, like the county I live in, Rockland County. I was credited with 6,212 votes, 5.8%, which is actually about what the one poll that did mention my name showed me to be getting 5% of the vote, which of course is huge for an independent candidate, absolutely huge. But it would make sense given what we had to do to get on the ballot. So at any rate, that night I had 6,200 votes in Rockland County, 5.8%. By the next morning, my vote there was 277, down to 0.2%.
Wow.
Yeah. So I said either people are really incompetent, there's no one watching the switch if they're going to, rejigger the figures. You'd think they'd want to hide it. But I thought also, some years ago, Lyndon LaRouche had commissioned a report on Leo Strauss. Do you know that name? University
Leo Strauss? No, I don't think so.
He had this, how do you get a dictatorship? Or we call them the ignoble liars. The idea is not merely the big lie, but one way of instilling terror is the dictator tells a lie that everyone knows is a lie, And the terror comes from your inability to do anything about it.
Mm.
Right? So they tell you something that's just totally false. You know that it's false, but they are mocking you in a sense, saying, well, forget it, you can't address this. So I thought perhaps that was more the message in my case: drop out, give up, shut up. That would certainly be of a piece with what you mentioned at the beginning, which is my name being posted on the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation list.
Well, yeah, and it sounds like it's in line with a lot of what we saw during Bernie Sanders' campaigns of how during the primaries, how his votes would change and votes would be drastically different than the exit polling data. And his campaign raised this issue after Iowa in 2016 and then never raised it again. So whatever was said to them to say, you're not going to be talking about this issue, it worked. And they never brought up exit polls being different or anything else ever again. Yeah, the Democratic machine and the control they have, and obviously the Republican have control of their side of things, but is truly insane. But yeah, let's get to and I want to talk more about other things they did to you during your campaign, but let's get to the Ukrainian, some people are calling it the hit list. It's this council that is the part of the Ukrainian government that unveiled this list of 72, I believe it was.
Initially, it's
What
been
they called,
expanded now. It's 95 to 95 now.
oh, it's up to 95.
Yeah.
What they called information terrorists. And when they unveiled this list, there was a U.S. State Department representative in the room.
Right.
I mean, this is really done with it was like a proud parent at a child recital, applauding. And not only is Rand Paul on there, but you're on there, and that perhaps has some significance because Chuck Schumer has been a big part of helping fund and this proxy war and make sure the information is along the lines of what the U.S. empire wants.
Sure. I mean, Scott Ritter actually sent a letter to Schumer, Gillibrand, and his congressman, who is Tonko, demanding to know whether the U.S. government is giving money, which all of them voted to support, to an entity which is trying to suppress freedom of speech in the United States. And I would say not only giving money, but directing their actions. I think it's despicable that people who are supposed to represent us, both myself and Scott Ritter are New York residents. So Schumer, Gillibrand, they are our representatives in the US Senate. Neither had anything to say. And in fact, actually, I had the opportunity, a few of my colleagues confronted Gillibrand, asking her, saying, we know that Scott Ritter sent you this letter. Why are you voting to fund an agency that's putting people on kill lists and calling Americans information terrorists? And she said, oh, I don't know anything about it. I'll look into it. Here's the card of the people. So they followed up. They had a meeting with her staff in Washington. And I saw her at a town hall meeting a month later, and I said, you never got back to anyone. You said you were investigating. And she went on to say in this meeting that the Ukrainian kill list did not exist, that we didn't understand it, and it was Russian disinformation. I mean, unbelievable. And that very morning, I had received a package, which I told my treasurer, who gets the mail, to please take it to the police department because it rattled, and it had a return address that said something about a Ukrainian church or something. And I said, please don't bring this thing in the office. Take it to the police department. We don't know what it is. And she said, well, if you don't feel secure, we should help your security. I mean, people should feel secure, and you should definitely go to the FBI. And I'm saying, oh yeah, the FBI, they're really going to do a great job. I'm sure all over my office as it is.
Right, exactly. So, I guess tell people what, and I realize that a lot of the people viewing this probably already know many of these facts, but What types of things were you saying about the war in Ukraine that seems to have scored you a position on this list?
Well, first, let me just say that, well, a couple of things. One, on the new list, even President Museveni of Uganda is on this hit list. I mean, these
And
people,
and Roger Waters.
yeah, it's really something. But the original list, the first 31 names on it were people who had spoken at a series of conferences organized by the Schiller Institute. So almost half the list.
Really?
Yes, and of course that's Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the widow of Lyndon LaRouche, who is, I think, still to this day the most controversial political figure in this country, even after his death. What were the conferences dedicated to? And the people who participated did not agree with each other, but they were to create a dialogue of how do we end this conflict? How can we have a negotiated settlement? How can we have a new security architecture which allows nations to have their security guaranteed, to have economic development, to not be put at risk by other nations. And we're really hearkening back to the Treaty of Westphalia, which, as you may know, Tony Blair called for ending some time ago. But so that was it, really. I guess it's a war crime if you don't want war. If you are opposed to a war of annihilation, you are committing a crime against war. And that was the thing that 31 of us on the list had in common. Others, like Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Scott Ritter, who had not yet spoken at a Schiller Institute event, had in common that they were telling the truth, that this did not begin with February 24th, the so-called Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which of course was provoked by the US, NATO, the UK, and really goes back much farther to the NATO expansion, which James Baker III explicitly promised Gorbachev would not occur. But in the shorter arc, you can say to 2013, 2014, when the United States and the UK, I learned in the last year, apparently, that Christopher Steele of the famous Steele dossier had written no less than 60 letters to Victoria Nuland and Company during 2013, 2014 on how to deal with Ukraine, right? So it was, again, this...
And Victoria Nuland was pivotal in helping create that coup and in putting in the US-backed government afterwards.
Right. She was out there on the Maidan handing out Twinkies and cupcakes to people who were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Now she's been eating them herself, I would say, from her appearance. But
yeah, she's the one who the leaked phone call where she says "fuck the EU."
Right. Well, they did that with the Nord Stream pipeline, so she got her wish on that one, I guess.
Right. And so you get put on this list, and is the list ongoing, or did they cancel one list and started a new one? Or
well, they took it down briefly. I think it really didn't look good, and frankly, it was backfiring, I would say, because a bunch of us started getting press coverage that they didn't want us to get. Then they reposted it and added a bunch of names, including, as you said, Roger Waters, Museveni, others. And I can't keep track if they've taken it down or put it up. I don't know where it stands at this very moment, to tell you the truth. And there's a related list, the Mirotvorets list, which I'm not pronouncing correctly, but the so-called peacekeeper list in Ukraine, where literally once they've eliminated you, they put a big liquidated in red across your picture. And this CCD list apparently was used as a source for the Mirotvorets list, which I don't know if I'm on that one or not. It has about 100,000 people on it, and it's harder to search. I know Mrs. LaRouche is on it. Scott Ritter is on it. They have children on it. They have over 300 children on this list. And they put your home address, your birthday, videos of your Christmas party, whatever, I mean, it's really nasty. And I just read an article by Deborah Armstrong. Now they're doing facial recognition. So uh, it's really sinister. And look, I don't think Ukraine. I don't even know if Zelensky goes to the bathroom without permission from his intelligence community handlers in the West. Really, so to say it's a
Right.
Ukrainian originated thing, no, we chose to support that just as we chose to support ISIS or arm Al Qaeda. This was a choice, it was a tool of choice to revive this Nazi culture at this time.
And I think one of the biggest examples of Zelensky giving in to whatever Western interests tell him to is in April. Apparently, there was a peace deal that was pretty close to being signed between Zelensky and Putin, Ukraine and Russia. And Boris Johnson went over there and met with Zelensky and essentially said that if you can sign this, but that means you're losing the entire West as allies, and basically we will leave you hung out to dry if you sign this thing. And then Ukraine pulled out of it and has never, no, they haven't sat back down at the peace table since. So the US and UK clearly want this to, they want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian.
They do. I think there's beginning to be a little bit of some people are recognizing that Russia is not going to lose. And Russia, as you know, has massed, I don't know, a couple 100,000, 300,000 more troops. As the ground freezes, they are ready. There's no point of holding back anymore because there's clearly no one who will negotiate with them. So this will not end through negotiations. So they're in a position where they have to militarily defeat the country, annihilate it. The Ukrainians have taken horribly high rates of fatalities and casualties. Apparently, now there's 1,000 dead Polish soldiers. It's being reported that the people listening into the conversations of the Ukrainian forces are hearing French, English, Polish. There's a lot of American troops right now, at least in Romania, apparently. I think it's extremely dangerous because if the policy of the UK, which they said explicitly, is that Russia cannot be allowed to win, and Russia, for moral and historical reasons, knows that it cannot lose, then will this cross the line to nuclear war or even chemical or biological war? Will it cross the line to something really hideous that threatens the existence of the human species? And what I keep asking myself is who will stop this? Where do the brakes come in? And so you're seeing some things like Mark Milley, who I think is, I don't like him, I'll put it that way. I think he's kind of a disloyal fellow, but he started talking about the need for negotiations. I don't know how long the Europeans really want to be our allies, since Liz Truss and Tony Blinken had that sweet little text about blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
You're referring to the leaked text that they've tried to refute, but between Liz Truss, when she was prime minister for about 8 seconds, but it was during the explosion of the Nord Stream, she texted Tony Blinken and said it's done.
Exactly. So, I mean, do you really need an ally? Is it friendship if someone smashes your teeth and pokes your eyes out and then says, I'm going to tie you and leave you in the closet to starve to death? I mean, that's what we're doing to our great European allies. So I'm wondering how long they want to put up with that. Somewhere this has got to give. Otherwise, we're finished. And that's why the thing that you showed earlier with Helga Zepp-LaRouche on the question of principles, mm-hmm. I think this is really the key, because when you get to this point where there's so many details, there's so much disinformation. I do a show on Friday nights, and I had a fellow on to talk about the drug legalization, but he wanted to go on a rant on how Putin's losing the war, and I mean, just total disinformation. So I thought, how do you, someone like that, how do you end the war, even if people still believe the lying garbage that it was an unprovoked Russian invasion?
Right.
They may believe that, but they may also see that there's hideous suffering going on, hundreds of thousands of people losing their lives. So, could we come up with some principles that all of us can agree on?
Okay.
Like, human beings are fundamentally good. We should have governments that protect human life. Um, that we should work together on eradicating poverty. Do people have a right to have clean drinking water? Um, what would a rational healthcare system actually look like? I mean, one of the fundamentals of healthcare is good nutrition. If people are starving, then you're going to have, whether they're manufactured in the lab or they're naturally created, when your immune system is destroyed by stress, all kinds of new horrible things can come into existence. So, could we not get an agreement in the domain of principle, where we say, look, this order hasn't worked, we need a new order, we're going to have to forget the crimes that were committed in the past. This is what they did with the Treaty of Westphalia. And people say, how can you ever did that? They did, well, believe me, in the religious wars, in the 100 years or 30 years religious wars, they committed some pretty horrible crimes. Religious wars are famous for that: torture, hacking limbs off, hideous things. And people had to recognize, if they continued down the path of retribution, it would never end. So somehow we have to leap. We cannot get there in a linear, stepwise fashion. We're going to have to leap to change our identity as a species. We're not animals. We're human beings. We're capable of changing.
So on a tenet like that, so say we all agree that clean water is a human right. Uh, is this just about everybody agreeing to that, or is it about like who enforces that, or how
Good
does that
question.
work?
Well, that's a very good question. Then we'd have to work on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps we should clean the British intelligence agents and Wall Street crooks out of the United Nations. I mean, that FDR had a certain idea of a peace order after World War II, and the British, in particular, made sure the war went on until he was dead, so he wouldn't be around to ensure what he envisioned, which is that every single nation would have its independence. There would be no more colonies. So they couldn't let that happen. So the Normandy landing was, the war was made longer than it had to be in order to make sure that you had someone like Truman who would be willing to drop nuclear bombs on Japan and basically get rid of all the agreements. I mean, sometimes, do you ever think to yourself, well, why is it that Russia's our enemy and Canada is not? I mean, isn't it just arbitrary? You say, well, why? Why didn't we decide Canada?
Well, initially, obviously, it had to do with the fear of the great communist menace. You can't possibly have someone organize their society in a way outside of capitalism. It's the same with our ongoing hatred of Cuba, for not just hatred but economic war against them for 60 years. What exactly have they done to us over the past 30 years?
Right, but see, Canada, the British royalty is still their head of state, so I think we have much more legitimate grievances with Canada, actually, if you want to look at it historically.
Oh, we love all the former British colonies nowadays. Australia, there are Five Eyes, right?
Yeah, right. I just think we somehow mankind has got to grow up, and I'm afraid if we don't do it pretty quickly, we're not going to have a chance to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. It takes evolution of thought, evolution of the mind, revolution of the mind. That does seem to be the only way this is going to happen. Um, to go back and we can certainly come back to this as well, but to go back to the election, because I am, I've done a lot of coverage over the years of how our two-party system is codified and solidified, and how they keep anybody who's outside of that out of ever succeeding and winning slots in our federal government. And there's multiple steps to it. One of the biggest one is simply money. People don't people will talk occasionally about how the person who spends the most money wins 90% of the time in the House and over 80% in the Senate. However, almost no one seems to mention that the two people who spend the most amount of money win 100% of the time. So if you aren't one of those top two, multi-millionaires, you aren't going to win a slot in the government. But then they have other ways as well, which, so can you talk about some of the things that were done to make it just incredibly difficult for you to win your Senate campaign, or third parties in general, such as the leaving you off the polls?
Sure. Yeah, and the ballot access requirements. And look, I want to be very clear with Americans. You have to realize we are living in a totalitarian state. We are in a dictatorship. We have censorship. We have elections where whatever they even do with the voting machines, it's rigged from the get-go, which I'll go through. And we have to figure out how to change this. The world is depending on us, and they're wondering, frankly, what's wrong with us if we all really like Biden so much and the direction of the war, or if we want something else. So in the state of New York, and this kind of thing is going on nationally, I've heard about it in other states as well, but basically you had an agreement between the parties that they two things. One is they had $100 million slush fund, which will be provided for matching funds, which begins in 2024. So in preparation for this $100 million matching fund pot, which I'm not eligible, federal candidates don't get it, only state candidates. They said, well, we don't want to spend money on frivolous candidates. So therefore, we're going to make it really hard to get on the ballot. Now, everyone knows that if you're running as a Democrat or Republican, or in the case of New York, conservative or working families who basically sold their souls to become shadow parties of the Republican and Democratic Party, you're credible just because you're a Democrat. So you don't have to jump through these hoops to get on the ballot, or you're a Republican. They can have their nominating conventions and you get on the ballot and there's no petitioning. If you want to challenge, if you're in the Democratic Party and you want to challenge the incumbent Schumer, say, then you can petition. And in the state of New York, it was 15,000 signatures over 6 weeks, which is already a very onerous requirement. John McCain was not able to get on the ballot. He had to file a lawsuit in the state of New York when he ran for president for the Republican nomination. He couldn't make it, couldn't get those 15,000 signatures. So, so that's already very difficult. And I was bracing myself for that. Oh, and I should say that the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Independence Party, they had a provision if you got 1% of the vote or 50,000 votes, and you had a candidate for governor or U.S. president, that is a statewide candidate, not U.S. Senate, but those two seats, and you got over 50,000 votes, you would get ballot status. So in 2018, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Serve America Party, they all had over 50,000 votes for their gubernatorial candidates. So they were all supposed to be on the ballot automatically, have a nominating convention, and be able to have their slate on the ballot. Well, in order to get rid of the frivolous candidates, whom, if you add them all up, over 250,000 people in New York voted for these frivolous candidates, you had to disenfranchise those 250,000 voters and say, no, it's going to be 150 or 130,000 votes and 45,000 signatures in 6 weeks, which no one in the state had ever done before. So they made an impossible, what they intended to be an impossible requirement, just coming off the end of COVID lockdowns and everything else, to get this number of signatures. And the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, everyone else failed to qualify. I did that. I turned in 66,000 signatures. We did not hire people to do this. I did not pay people to do this. I said, we are in danger of nuclear war. That's the issue. That's what I'm going to raise in this campaign. And people signed. They don't want nuclear war. So I got on the ballot. So I met their stupid, arbitrary requirement. Then they decided to have a debate between Schumer and a fellow named Joe Pinion, who was the Republican nominee for US Senate. So I called the station, Optimum, is that what, yeah. And I said, look, or not I, but my campaign manager, this must be an oversight because Diane Sare met this outrageous requirement. She got 66,000 signatures to be on the ballot. She is on the ballot. There's only 3 candidates. She should be included in the debate. And the cable station said, oh, no, we have our own requirements, and she didn't make it. So we said, well, what is that? Well, she has to get 15% of the vote in the opinion polls. Well, I was already onto this because my petitioners had called the office and said, a couple people called in. We got called about who we're voting for US Senate. And when we said we're voting for Diane Sare, we were told that wasn't an option.
Right.
So you have an opinion poll, which doesn't even allow people to say they're voting for me, on which I have to get 15% of the vote to be allowed in the debate. So it was pretty unbelievable, really unbelievable. I mean, not unbelievable, but it's believable. We're in a totalitarian state right now, but outrageous. And the terrible thing is the voters don't know this. That may be the worst. The voters actually don't realize that the reason why there's no one to vote for is because all the interesting candidates have been thrown off the ballot before you even get into the polling place.
Yeah, and to give some other examples, a similar thing happened with Tulsi Gabbard. I can't remember if it was 2016 or 2020, but they kept her off at least a few of the debate stages by simply changing their polling requirements. She's got to get 3% in the poll. Oh, never mind, it's 5%. Oh, it's 7% or whatever, just to keep her off the debate stage. Matthew Hoh, a Green Party candidate in North Carolina, got the number of ballot signatures well over needed to be in the Democratic primary. And then the city council that was Democrats or whatever council, it might not have been a city council, but they just decided to throw out his signatures because they said it was fraud when it wasn't. And then the courts overturned it. So he ultimately did get to run, but the Democratic Party did everything they could to make sure there was not a candidate to their left.
Right. And I'll say the Republican Party in New York nominated Lee Zeldin. There were several Republicans who petitioned to get on the ballot to have a primary, and the Republican Party tried to throw them all off the ballot. And they all had to go to court, and they managed to be on. But, it's really terrible. And it certainly does nothing to encourage people to participate in the process.
Do you feel, and I feel like this naturally gets to this question, do you feel our federal government represents the people in really any way anymore now? I mean, the large Princeton study I always like to reference from 2014 showed that if the American people want something and it doesn't align with corporate interests, there is 0% chance that it will get through Congress. Like, literally, they can't find an example over the past 20 years when something goes through Congress and is accepted by our federal government when it doesn't align with corporate interests.
No, exactly. But unfortunately, I'm afraid the American people have become terribly corrupt as well. And you have to cut it out. I'm maybe this is on my mind because I just read 2 essays that came from Scott Ritter's Substack. I don't know if you saw them. Kevin, I forget his name, who wrote about the good Ukrainian people, and basically they're saying that Ritter is being unduly harsh on Ukrainians. There's good Ukrainians, and then Ritter writes back, well, what have they tolerated? I mean, sure, there's a heavy price to pay in Ukraine if you don't go with the narrative, but it's been creeping up for some time. People didn't have to go along with it all that time. It seems harsh, but I look at it here in the United States. People have been too willing to go along with these police state type measures, which have been creeping in. I mean, you can go back to, frankly, the death of Franklin Roosevelt and the McCarthyite witch hunts and J. Edgar Hoover. Then you have the assassinations of the 60s. I mean, 4 of them, right? Both Kennedys, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Their family members are all saying,
Fred Hampton. Yeah.
We don't believe the narrative. This is not a lone assassin, you know. Then I know from what they did to Lyndon LaRouche, who was running for president, had 250,000 subscribers to a publication. The publication was shut down by the government, and he was framed up on conspiracy charges. And then you have 9/11, which I think, in effect, is sort of the era that we're living in now, where there's no way anyone who thinks about it, you look at what occurred. A bunch of planes are hijacked. The Pentagon is hit, the World Trade Center. And somehow it's supposed to be some guy with kidney failure sitting in a cave in Afghanistan who's coordinating this whole thing. It's just absurd. Didn't happen. There had to be.
Well, okay. There was just too many things all at once. One thing I wanted to go back to look at what the American people have allowed. And I agree with you partially. I do. Americans have allowed too much. I mean, we live in the largest police state in the world in sense of prison population, the largest prison state in the world, as one of many examples. However, I do think a lot of it is simply believing the propaganda. So, you know, if people are told these things on CNN and MSNBC, and unfortunately they believe them, I don't know that always is just like, oh my God, they allowed that. Yeah, it could be, oh my God, they believed what was on the news, I suppose. But.
Well, I think that they have more responsibility. Look, if we have a policy that could lead us to a war with Russia, you have an obligation to find out the truth. Now, maybe you are so dumb that you don't realize that the US and Russia both have nuclear weapons, in which case your stupidity may be the end of you and you may die of something else otherwise for being so stupid. I'm not sure. But, or at least your children, you know, I mean, I look at small time corruption. There was a guy, I think he was running for mayor in Trenton, New Jersey, and he had, I forget what it was, $5,000 or something in his freezer. I may not be getting the details right, but people are selling their soul for $100, you know, and partly that's, you could argue it's the economic hardship people are facing. So people feel very desperate. So then they do desperate things.
Yeah, absolutely. We're the largest, the United States is the largest paid blood country in the world. We like 94% or something of paid blood donations comes from the United States, because most countries it's illegal to pay someone for their blood. So the United States has literally become vampiric. Yeah,
no, that's right. But see, that's corrupt. It stinks. And we have to demand ourselves. We have to be better. People should be truthful and demand that others meet the same standard. Because when someone says, well, who can I trust? I feel like I can't trust anyone. Well, there's a reason why you're saying that. And then I think you have to look in the mirror and say, am I trustworthy? Am I conducting myself in a way where people should trust? Do I trust myself? So this worries me. I think our culture is very bad. And I guess people do get worse if they're depressed. There's a great deal of depression because of the economic collapse. So that is a factor.
There is. So does a lot of this come back to capitalism?
Well, the free trade system, you know, some people today, if they really understood what Alexander Hamilton was doing, would say he was a communist. And he wasn't. Yeah, I mean, Ben Franklin had a whole polemic about people who didn't want to pay taxes. He said, if you don't want to pay taxes, go live in the woods somewhere as a hermit, because if you use the road, if you drink the water or whatever, you know, you're part of a society, you're going to pay taxes. The government it's in our Constitution, which is the general welfare. We're supposed to promote the general welfare. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the government's supposed to run and dictate every detail of your life, but it means there are certain guarantees that the government should be responsible for. I mean, imagine trying to build a national high-speed rail grid without government oversight on that. A whole bunch of little private state companies trying to connect the rail the right way. It would never work, right? So the government has the responsibility for that. Unfortunately, no one seems to read Alexander Hamilton anymore, or the Henry Carey, or others.
I think you're getting to something very important, which is it may say, or we may in the slogan of America say, you know, that the government is going to work for the common good in some manner, but the economic system says there is no obligation to the common good. It is all for profit. Every moment, every resource, every drip of water is basically, where can we get profit from this? And that has infected or really taken over the entire system. So the idea that we could have a federal government that is separate from the motivation, the sole motivation of capitalism. And if you talk to, you know, someone on a board of a big corporation, they'll say, I have a legal responsibility to do whatever will get the best value for the shareholder. And they will try to argue that, oh, well, you know, maybe it's not good for people, maybe it harms human beings, but I'm doing the legal thing, which is best for my shareholders. And so profit just takes over the entire system.
Well, one, I'd say that sort of demonstrates what I said. It's collective immorality. Because in the long run, where does that get you really? I mean, how long is each one of us going to be alive? Supposing that we do really well, we're really healthy, maybe we can live to be 100 or 105 or 110, maybe. But that's a really tiny sliver out of 5 billion years that the Earth has been here. So what's actually important, and what you discover if you think from that standpoint, is the things that are important are the things that are actually not in the physical domain. You know, I mean, I always think of Beethoven, but what he left us, the music that he created, the product of his mind, and or Einstein, someone who makes a great discovery, or millions of people we don't know who did incredible things, which are why we are able to be here today. That's what really matters. And somehow we've become very short-sighted. We don't think of that anymore. And so we got to change that. And I think the change goes hand in hand with the culture. If you had a great leader, if we had a Franklin Roosevelt who came in and said, look, we're going to put these Wall Street bankers in jail, we're going to revive the Pecora Commission hearings, we're going to build major infrastructure, we're going to get rid of poverty. I think even though it would take 25 years or more to get us to the standard of living we should have, just having leadership that has a commitment to the well-being of the people would completely change the culture of the country. Don't you think?
I agree that a great leader can be very important, can be crucial. But I would say even in the instance of FDR, you had large-scale movements that allowed FDR to make those changes. You had strikers dying on the front lines of these strikes, workers. You had people fighting back in so many ways, and that gave FDR the leverage to make those changes.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. So where are we marching?
Where are we marching tomorrow?
Yeah.
Absolutely. What was it you said? Something I wanted to come back to. Oh, you mentioned kind of deep time, how long the time scale is, and we act like this moment is everything. And I think that's an important point because, people cannot picture they act like we're at the end of history, that, this unfettered capitalist death spiral we're in, which has led to endless war and resources collapsing around us, the environment collapsing around us. We act like people act like that's the end of history. This is the best we can do economically. This is all there will ever be. This is it. And in fact, industrial capitalism has been around for 200 years and managed to destroy a lot of the world in that time period. And meanwhile, we've been on the, humans have been on the planet for whatever, 1 million years, or advanced humans.
Well, but see, there is the question of industrial capitalism, the word you used. I mean, suppose we stick with the American system as Hamilton talks about it in his paper on the subject of manufacturers, and there was a big debate during his time, and I think still goes on, because you had all these agrarians who said, no, wealth is from the farm, it's from the farm, it's from the land. And he said, no, really it's the human mind, it's a discovery. It's discoveries and inventions, right? That you figure out a way that allows yourself to use the resources you have more efficiently. And when you make a discovery, and so therefore a discovery in a mechanical principle, say, can also increase your agricultural output, right? Having new ways to plow the field, or new things about fertilizer or irrigation. So what you discover is that this principle of scientific discovery that massively increases your economic output, even with nominally the same raw materials that you're starting with, because you figure out more efficient ways of making use of what you have. So that increases the division of labor, and it makes it possible for more people to contribute to the workforce, and more people to, say, specialize. You don't only want specialists, you have to have people who have an overview, who think about the process as a whole. And this is what LaRouche developed, actually, is the way you measure your economic success is if you can sustain more people on a given area of land at a higher standard of living. So the population density should increase. And as it increases, the standard of living does too, which goes really counter to what is promoted today in this green ideology. And it's also very much tied to energy. You have to have dense forms of energy. You cannot do this on solar panels.
True, but doesn't that depend on how you define standard of living? I mean, in the United States, many people view a good standard of living as having 12 more rooms than you yourself can use, and 3 cars for every family member, and tons of land you'll never step on. And so I suppose it depends on how you define standard of living.
Well, yes, if you say things like life expectancy, infant mortality, how many languages do you speak? Do you play an instrument? Do you have a chemistry set that might blow up your basement? Has your basement been fortified to withstand your chemistry experiments? That kind of thing. So I don't think that's, yes, you're right. But I think that you can demonstrate that most people, you could take the inverse, would agree that if you're sickly, if you die by the age of 30, if you're eating spoiled, rotten food infested with maggots, or you're eating maggots, that probably is not a high standard of living, that you don't want to go in that direction. And what you see going on now in Europe and the US, even because of the sanctions and the war policy, is people are going backwards. They're going to increase the death rate because they're burning wood. In other words, you're going back to more primitive platforms, if you will, of economy where you could not sustain as many people per square mile. So when you go backwards in that way, what you will find is you will actually increase the death rate. I mean, look at Haiti. If you want to see, they get 75 or 80% of their power from charcoal.
So, but technology is a tool. I mean, and there's an argument to be made that with advanced technology, we've actually made the world less livable, considering the various environmental collapses we're on the brink of, whether it be deforestation or climate crisis or plastics in the oceans, or the fact we've lost 50% of all land animals over the past 40 years. So I mean, that came with advanced technology. So technology is a tool. It can be used for harm or used for good.
Right. Well, that's why Douglas MacArthur on the battleship Missouri, when he said we have to abolish war, he said now that the human species can annihilate itself, that you cannot use war as a means for resolving conflicts. And he actually called for a spiritual recrudescence, the way he got the sense that he said our scientific capability has outstripped our moral character. And therefore, we're going to have to bring ourselves culturally up to the level where we can responsibly make use of the discoveries that we have made.
Responsible use of discovery sounds good to me. I like that part. I noticed I think there were signs at maybe one of your rallies, and so I guess I'm assuming it's one of your big messages was no more nuclear war, nuclear power.
Yes.
Or so I get a lot of the positives of nuclear power, but aren't there a lot of harmful situations with nuclear power? You know, with
Well, like anything,
Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island. A lot of these things are pretty
no one
risky, you know.
died at 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, frankly, this will be very controversial, but I think demonstrated the safety of nuclear power because it was hit by this giant tsunami. And while you have a mess that's being cleaned up to this day, you did not have a whole bunch of people dying of radiation. So, and it was an older, it
They
was
all
an,
fled. Didn't
yeah,
they
the
leave?
tsunami. But what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
we should see, you can't stay at one level. And the new nuclear power plants, I guess they're third or fourth generation, one can recycle the spent fuel. So what you really don't want to be doing is burying all this waste. We should reprocess it. You can use about 96% of it again. They also have new kinds of reactors where the fuel is coated in ceramic so that the reaction actually shuts down if it surpasses a certain temperature. So you physically cannot have a meltdown of that type of plant. So there's a lot that's done. I think one of the reasons why they make nuclear power so controversial and scary is because you need such a small amount of fuel. And if countries in Africa and South America and elsewhere had access to nuclear power, and ultimately we should really get to fusion, which is a whole different process.
Yeah, I assume we wouldn't have time, but I was going to mention fusion. It seems like we could be 10 years from fusion.
Yes, I think so. And ideally, we'd want to get there. But in the meantime, if you're going to eradicate poverty, you have to have energy. You really have to have energy. And they've cleaned up coal quite a bit. If you're stuck, better to use coal than charcoal and burning wood, which is what we're doing. But I think you have to have energy if you're going to manage your resources. Have clean water, green the deserts, all of these things, grow food indoors, uh, hydroponic farming. There's all kinds of very interesting things. All of them require energy. So
Yeah.
if you make it really scary and tell everyone you don't want to have this because it's scary and dangerous, well, then people will die. I mean, it's sort of like there were huge arguments against electric light bulbs, when we first discovered them. Everyone said, you can't have electricity, you can't have light bulbs, everyone's going to burn down all the buildings.
Well, for a while, most governments made a lot of efforts to tell everybody nuclear was safe. For a while.
Yeah, and then we became Malthusian genocidalists, so we changed the line.
So, what else? What else haven't I brought up that you would like to discuss? I know you said you've already announced you're running in 2024. I don't know if you want to talk about that or.
Well, I am, because it was clear that they loved my previous campaign so much. I thought I better get right back out there again and offend all the right people. Gillibrand doesn't seem to be as juicy a target as Schumer, but if you look at the conferences that she's been involved in, she's pretty bad. And it's not really that. It's really about providing leadership, trying to set a standard for what a congressman or senator should do, what issues someone should be concerned about, and giving voice to people who don't have a voice. And you mentioned the prison situation. I'm about to plunge into a book by, I don't remember the name of the author, but it's called Life and Death in Rikers Island, who was the medical, in charge of the medical situation in the New York prisons. Eager to see about that. You have so many people in our nation right now who don't have a spokesman. They don't have a champion, or they have champions, but it's somehow hard to get unified. I think we have to speak for the people who don't have a voice, who don't have the money, or have been so downtrodden that they don't even think that they have a voice anymore.
I'm truly not trying to be snarky or anything, but a moment ago you said, I thought these people were fools, and now you're saying it's just that they don't have a champion.
That's fair. Well, I don't think it's all the same. There's a lot of people who have money and power who could do something differently, who have decided to be immoral and corrupt. And then there's a lot of people who have been thrown on the scrap heap who are not in a position to change things. I mean, I believe any person could. You can have a Joan of Arc, you could have a Martin Luther King, but that requires an extraordinary quality of genius and courage. Frederick Douglass, to get out of that kind of circumstance. Those people are one in millions, maybe, who find their way out of that mess.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage and takes a large amount of education on a lot of things usually.
Yeah, or inspiration.
Education and inspiration, yes. All right, well, that's pretty much it, unless I missed anything that you wanted to bring up, and you can definitely let people know where they can follow you.
Yeah, I have a website, sareforsenate.com, and that's S-A-R-E, sareforsenate.com. I am still, knock on wood, on Facebook and Twitter, Telegram, some. You can find me there. But if you go to the website, you can sign up for my emails. And I do think we need to have that big march. I think people have to get out in the streets. So we should be looking for that. I hope when you organize it, Lee, you'll let me know.
All right. Well, I'll get on that. Thank you again, Diane, for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. All right, everybody, that is Diane Sare, the Senate candidate added to the Ukrainian hit list for calling Ukraine a proxy war and a war that needed to be ended, but should not be happening at all. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. On Thursday, I believe it is, I'll be talking to Ben Norton, the founder and editor of Multipolarista, an incredible site. You also probably remember his work from the Gray Zone. Ben Norton does amazing stuff, and we're going to hit on a lot of topics. So I hope you'll catch that interview. We are completely independently funded. So if you want to see this show continue, please become a patron over at patreon.com/behind the headlines. This is a project with Mint Press. Mint Press, another amazing outlet that you should definitely check out if you don't know it. And there's a new episode of The Most Censored News, which is the other show I do with Mint Press. That comes out tomorrow at youtube.com/behind the headlines. Please make sure and click subscribe and let people know. I have interviews coming up with Richard Wolff, Stella Morris in January, Katie Halper soon. So all of these interviews are coming up, and hopefully you will find out about them by subscribing at youtube.com/behind the headlines. And yeah, keep this show going because I like doing it for you. I like doing it with you, hanging out with you guys. So I will see you soon. See you Thursday. Thanks again. Keep fighting.